This week's show brought to you by the Trump Tower Grill Taco Bowls, the taco bowl of its fingers. Welcome back to another Boxscore Geek show. The playoffs are in full swing. There is tons we could be talking about, but of course, what we're going to be talking about is Donald Trump. And I made a mistake. To do that intro, I got the tweet of him tweeting the taco bowl up, and his face is looking at me on my computer right now. It's terrifying me. Anyway, we have a very special guest for tonight's show about that very topic. As I've already mentioned, Jonathan, I'm going to mess up this word a lot, but we have Jonathan Weiler, professor at UNC, and you have written several times on the subject of authoritarianism, which relates to Donald Trump. So we were so excited to have you on to discuss Donald Trump the week after he pretty much locked up the Republican nomination. So, Jonathan, how are you feeling?
Great. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
And I was going to say, obviously, I don't know if this is public social media on your part, but one joke you made is I think you were lucky enough to go to London and visit what's the Harry Potter site, the train station that they
Oh
made.
yeah, the track 9 3/4. Yes.
You actually got a funny photo there, and you said, "New plan. You're just going to go to Hogwarts for the next 4 years instead of having to see what's going on." Which,
Right. I had originally tweeted that I was going to be placed into a medically induced coma for the next 6 months, and the backup plan was just to go to Hogwarts until the election is over. So
yeah. So I mean, this has gotten interesting, and as mentioned, I think you are a jack of all trades. I'm impressed because obviously, what we normally talk to you about is our two main focus on the show, which is economics and sports. You have the fantastic blog, the ESPN Watch, where you point out lots of problematic aspects of ESPN as well as your own takes. But then also, I've got to throw this out here before we get down to this. You've recently written a book called "Divorce: A Love Story,"
yes,
um, with I believe your ex-wife Ann Minkins.
that is correct.
And
Yes.
we'll have to have another show or something to talk this at some point. But this is a fascinating subject to me because you're basically taking the point that the marriage didn't work, but the relationship and the kid and all that, there's a bunch there. And I love the subtitle, "A Love Story." So you've got that, which is on its own being a professor and that, but then also you've penned a book a few years ago, many years ago, way too early because as I mentioned on Twitter, I was reading it. But you, along with co-author, sorry, I'm just getting in front of it, get right, Mark
Yeah.
J. Hetherington, in
Yes. That's correct.
2009, wrote a book, Authoritarianism and Polarization in American Politics. I started reading through it today, and it's shocking how much it applies. And of course, this was written at the start of the Obama administration, way before people thought Trump was going to come to power. And so, actually, I'd be curious on this. You've clearly been done research on this for a while, and you got some press from Vox recently. You were on CNN, I believe, to interview about this. But
Yeah.
what got you into this subject and the background, and how it, you said in American politics, so clearly this has been on your mind for years now.
Yeah, actually, so Mark is a very close friend of mine. He's a professor at Vanderbilt, but we taught at Bowdoin College in Maine together at the turn of the century. And actually, the first time we started talking about this subject, I don't think we were using the word authoritarianism back then, but the first time we talked about the subject that turned into that book was during the Florida recount in 2000. And we were just sort of watching with amazement as that process unfolded. And one of the things that struck us was that one side was treating that recount as if it were a matter of life and death. And the other side was sort of shrugging its shoulders and essentially taking a blasé attitude that, well, I hope it works out for the best. And it's the first time we really started talking about how the two sides were not alike in some very fundamental ways. So the conversation really started back then.
And yeah, I mean, it has gotten fascinating. And, I think pre-show we were even talking another author, Jonathan Haidt, who's talked a lot about polarization. And it has really been interesting, even just, the last decade and a half in politics. And there's lots of stuff I'll be throwing out, Brian, so I have no complaints if we get all the links. But I think like there are these fun charts that show, polarization in Congress. So I've got a question for you that I'm sure you've answered a ton of times and is answered in the book. But why has authoritarianism really had such a prevalent rise in kind of the last decade and a half. Is it all 9/11, or are there other factors?
So yeah, so it's interesting, Dre. The way we describe it is that it's not so much that there's been an aggregate increase in the sort of level of authoritarianism in society generally. It's that the those folks who are authoritarian or more authoritarian minded and those folks who are less authoritarian minded have clearly sorted themselves out over the last couple of decades. So whereas, for example, we have a chart in the book to this effect, whereas, for example, in 1992, more authoritarian minded folks were as likely to be Democratic as Republican, and less authoritarian folks were conversely as likely to be Republican as Democratic. Um, the change over the last now quarter of a century or so has been the degree to which the authoritarian minded folks have gravitated overwhelmingly, not completely, but overwhelmingly to the Republican Party, and the non authoritarian folks have gravitated overwhelmingly toward the Democratic Party. So it's the sorting that's really been the key driver over the last 25 years. And as we explain in the book, there's lots of factors that explain that development. We trace a history of this process really back to the 1960s and to the kind of racial appeals first honed by Richard Nixon and the silent majority and the fight against quote unquote crime and welfare that intensified in the 1970s. And then, of course, with Reaganism in the 1980s.
And this
And
is the
then
Southern strategy you're talking about, right? That
exactly the
was
Southern
Nixon.
strategy. Exactly.
That the
And so,
Democrats used to be the Southerners used to be Democrats, sorry, but Nixon pulled them over to the Republican side.
exactly. And, the Pat Buchanan, who at the time was a young columnist and speechwriter, and others, including a guy named Kevin Phillips, who wrote a classic book in the late 1960s called The Coming Republican Majority. They were the ones who, they asked this very basic question, which was, how do we begin to split up and break up the New Deal coalition, which has been delivering elections to Democrats for a generation? And one of the key sort of ideas that they stumbled upon was using sort of racial appeals to peel off, ethnic and blue collar white workers from the Democratic Party. So that began the process. And it's a process that's unfolded and sort of gathered steam over the past generation, with the rise of gay rights as a major issue, changing ideas about the family and gender. All of those things sort of layered on top of each other have contributed to the sorting process that we talk about.
And so something I'm curious about, and I want to compare this to sports. So for listeners, what I have said to Jonathan and Brian pre-show is my goal this entire time is it's as heavily politically motivated as a show, but I'm going to try and tie it as much back to sports because that is our wheelhouse.
Yes.
But something that is fascinating to me, a few ways to go, but obviously there is a very our team kind of mentality which has gotten odd. So for instance, the fact that Trump is now almost the de facto nominee. I mean, there's nothing left, right? I mean, they were hoping for maybe a brokered convention a while back, but that's out the window.
Yeah.
I don't know if there are any, if this were a story and we're looking for a Deus Ex Machina to come along, I don't know if there are any left to get Trump off the Republican Party. But you're seeing people that say, we really got to stand behind Donald Trump. He's our guy. He's our party. And this smacks so much of sports to me, where you go, now that Shaquille O'Neal is gone and Kobe's ancient, and there are all these other players that were why I like the Lakers that are no longer there. I'm not a Lakers fan anymore. And people, accuse you of being a fair weather fan or a bandwagon or whatever. It's funny how it seems like it's applying to politics to almost a scary degree, where someone can say almost the exact opposite of all of the things people say and they want in the party, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't. But someone can be completely outside of it and they go, well, I've got to support him because he's my president or because, he's the nominee or whatever.
Right. So, right. It's, it's the Seinfeld line that, we're all just rooting for laundry, right? So, what you're describing, Dre, is, a broader phenomenon, which is just this very intense era of polarization that we're in. And one thing that political scientists have talked about a lot in recent years is the degree to which people are actually more motivated by how much they hate the other party
Jeez.
than how much they like their own party.
That
That-
seems like the internet incarnate because I've noticed that too.
yeah,
The people that we have analytics on our site that tell us how many people come back daily, and we have a pretty good audience. But the
yeah,
people that are going to comment at me or comment at me on Twitter, they're so much more likely to say you were wrong or I dislike you. We were complaining about this a few weeks ago. I got to take at least one pot shot at 538 since we're taking politics. I was called insane by a senior writer at 538, and I kind of went, you're on a site 100 times the size of us, easily at minimum.
yeah.
Why are you going out of your way to knock an argument that you had 5 years ago with another site? So it is interesting how hate is such a motivator, both on the internet, and it's scary because you're saying if we think about how scary the internet and YouTube comments are, you're saying that that bleeds into politics.
Now,
Well,
Dre,
yeah,
just one thing on that. It's so one of the characteristics that I remember hearing about authoritarian personality is what you were talking about, that you like to praise those above you politically, but then you grind down those below you. Is that a part of it too?
yeah. I do think that sort of particularly hierarchical way of thinking is definitely it's an important part of the authoritarian mindset. But just to go back for a minute to this kind of negative partisanship more generally, and the connection to sports. I mean, being on Tobacco Road, I think about the degree to which I oftentimes am much more invested in Duke losing, you know, than I am even in UNC or Michigan or whoever it is that I root for winning. And I do think that there is something especially primal about the things that we dislike or even detest. And that politics has sort of arrived at that place is it's particularly unnerving, frankly, that this is, that viscera is the driving force behind our politics.
It was funny because I was talking with my wife about that, and I said it was remarkable the number of subjects that come up in every election. Obviously, things like anti-abortion, gay rights, bathrooms now, which I don't
Yeah.
know. It seems so ridiculous, but it's such a big deal. But I was talking to my wife, and I said so many of these things should rarely interact with people's lives. We're about to have a kid, and I said, the idea of abortion never even entered our minds. That was never a problem for us, and yet that's one of the biggest political things. Whereas, Obama with Obamacare, that was a huge deal for me. I'm self-employed, and basically making self-employed um, insurance affordable was such a big deal to me. But I was saying it's remarkable the number of subjects people will fight tooth and nail for that probably will not impact them in their lives. But the number of things that are genuinely, or probably, this sounds very paternalistic, I'm aware, but the number of things that genuinely are important to them or should be important to them that they basically just ignore and leave on the cutting room floor.
Well, and then I mean, you mentioned the bathroom issues, and of course, North Carolina has become ground zero for that fight because of this law that the state legislature passed and the governor signed a month ago, which is now the subject of a Department of Justice lawsuit against the state of North Carolina. And what I find so interesting about that is that until last fall, I guess Houston was the first major city to debate this issue. No one gave this a second thought. And the way it's being sort of stoked by the folks who are pushing for, you must use the bathroom corresponding to the gender on your birth certificate is a fear of something for which there's no evidence that it exists, which is that, somehow sexual predators are dressing up as women, for example, and going into bathrooms to prey on, women and girls. And so I just find it so interesting that an issue like that, which virtually no one can say this has affected them in their personal lives, has now become this explosive and intensively debated topic.
What's interesting to me on that one is it seems to fall into the this is we're getting into a weird place. So I'm going to do my best to keep this PG level, but obviously there are some dark topics.
Yeah.
But if you go to Yahoo, I see at least once a week a headline that says essentially female teacher has an affair with a young male student, middle school or high school.
Yeah.
If you look at the data, it's basically I believe, and this may be conservative, but I believe it's a 9-to-1 split the other way. I believe a majority of cases of improper affairs between older teachers and younger students tends to be male female. But if
Yeah.
you were to listen to the media cycle, you would believe it's all female male because that's all that ever gets reported. And I
Yes.
think to your point about the bathroom thing, the reality is if you look at the data, I believe essentially transsexual and transgender people are at a much higher risk for being assaulted and attacked, just being out.
Yes.
They are not the predators. They have never been the predators. No data ever says, man, there is this weird problem. It's the other way around. They're more at risk for being violently assaulted. But everybody thinks of these comedic movies where we see that exact thing. A man dressing up as a woman as a joke to sneak their way in somewhere. There was even an 80s sitcom with Tom Hanks called Bosom Buddies following that
Yes.
exact premise. Everybody thinks of that. That's what pops into their head, and no one looks at the data. And what's most frustrating, drawing us back to sports, the last couple of weeks, Jonathan, we've been having discussions about the usage curve and finals MVPs and what it takes to make a contender. And we basically have said all of the data disputes every single one of these conventional wisdoms that we deal with week after week after week. And it is impossible to convince people. When you tell people transgender people are not assaulting people in bathrooms, that is ludicrous. The data does not say it. You cannot get that out of their head. And it's just as hard in sports as saying you do not need to be the Philadelphia 76ers to win a title.
Well, I mean, this goes back to one of the ways that I like how Dave Barry talks about these kinds of issues is that he always talks about them in terms of the stories people tell, right? And we tell ourselves these stories to help us make sense of the world. And once we tell ourselves these stories, it's just very hard to dislodge them, even with overwhelming evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And then, of course, to your point, where it gets terrifying is when it gets turned into policy. The NBA, there hasn't been a policy shift where they said if you're a bad team, you must lose. That's teams that aren't paying attention. But we have policies in place that legitimately affect people's lives, and this has become very popular.
Yeah, and I mean to tie this back to Trump for a minute, one of the things that we talked about in the book was how it is that it's elites and political elites that sort of cast about, fish around for messages that they think are going to win them votes. And oftentimes, what they're casting about for are messages that stoke fear because that motivates people. Back to what we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, that negative emotions motivate people. And elites know they're doing this, and they're just trying to win votes, and they're largely indifferent to or amoral about the consequences of whatever they're advocating for. But for ordinary folks, many of them really are fearful of the things that these leaders are stoking. So I mean, I on the one hand feel a lot of frustration and anger and contempt for some ordinary folks when they adopt these what I think of are hateful attitudes, but they're coming by those honestly. Whereas the elites, and I think this goes for Trump, for example, they're being deliberately manipulative, and so that itself is just a very disturbing reality to think about.
Yeah, and
I've actually got a follow up, Dre. For
all right, go for it, Brian.
Just to jump in there. So I know this is a really big question, but one thing I keep seeing over and over again is the Trump is the media's fault, right? That the media has built him up and the media has pushed him on people, and that's the only reason why he's popular. Maybe, and of course they're not thinking about these other kind of authoritarian reasons, but I mean, is that true for what you're talking about? Like, does the media have any blame for cause? Because like if I ever turn to CNN, man, that is like 24/7 fear kind of stuff on CNN. You know, get scared, clutch your pearls. You know, so how does the media feed into that at all, or is it
So,
overrated?
so Brian, it's a great question. I think there are two. I think you've raised two different
Exactly.
ways that one could say the media is to blame, and then we can talk a little bit about how maybe that argument is overstated. One is just their own economic interest in having Trump on as much as possible because he's great for ratings, right? I mean, those early Republican debates last year, when it first became apparent that Trump was going to be a serious contender for the nomination, and people still couldn't believe it. And whatever network was broadcasting, Republican debates,
Huge ratings.
Fox or CNN, they were doing record ratings. So there's that piece of it, which is just the addiction of the Trump phenomenon in drawing eyeballs. And then there's the longer term issue, which I think is what you were also alluding to, Brian, that, after a steady diet of, I'm forgetting his name now, but there's a great sociologist, I think his name is Barry Glassner, who wrote a book maybe 15 years ago about news coverage of crime. Okay, and what he showed was that coverage of crime was only intensifying during the 1990s. That more and more there was a steadier and steadier diet of murder and mayhem and kidnapped, little girls and all of that during a decade when, as we now know, crime was beginning a historic drop throughout the United States. And so one of the consequences is that people had exactly the opposite impression of whether crime was going up than the reality would support. Crime is going down massively all over the United States, and people are convinced it's going up because of the way media is covering it. And so in that longer term sense, I do think there's a responsibility for media in having fed a steady diet of fear-inducing stories that then make people want to gravitate toward these kinds of candidates.
Something that's there are two fascinating things about that. First off, a preemptive shout out to John Oliver on Scientific Studies. If you haven't watched that, watch it. He bashes the media about how they kind of cherry pick scientific data and the exact issue we are discussing. And then the other side of that, Jonathan, which is fascinating to me on the, things are getting better but seem worse, is it seems like there is a major disconnect in how data is sent to people. And,
Uh,
by the way, there's absolutely no way we don't just come off as like elite snobs on this podcast. And I apologize. There's just no way around that, which I think there have been some articles I've read that say that's an issue, is basically a lot of the people that are quote unquote trying to help lower class people, particularly Democrats, come off very patronizing, and that makes it very rough to accept the help. But the disconnect between education and understanding the data, because when you tell someone in Michigan, you said you're Michigan alum, and then of course, I live, few hours out of it in Wisconsin. If the entire industry goes bust there, and you tell them, listen, white males are the most privileged people, and you are on the best time in human civilization, and everything is better, and crime's gotten better, they look at you and go, what are you talking about?
yeah.
And then additionally, when we have these issues of saying, there's an extreme disconnect between what the government does or what socialism is. So many people are just no socialism, that they don't get like how healthcare works. And something that's been, like I said, very positive for me, but also depressing is Obamacare, where I've had people that are getting fired from a job or leaving a job and say, I need to figure out healthcare and I don't know what to do. And I go, oh, you can go to this site and do this and this and this, and it's about as affordable. And they just have no idea. And so you run into this very hard spot where if you try and help, if some people who are trying to help, I'll phrase it that way, basically just get kind of backlash because they're very arrogant and smug. And I say that's someone who's coming off as arrogant and smug. Or the other side, you stoke the fears and say they're right. And neither of those seems like a very appealing place to end up.
Well, to your point, Dre, one of the things as I know you're aware, that's gotten so much attention in the last few months with Trump's rise to the nomination has been the degree to which he has drawn support from, so-called white working class voters. And to some degree, that I think that misstates the reality, because, as Nate Silver wrote recently, the median Trump primary voter, their median income is like $72,000, so they're actually fairly well off. But I think it is important to take seriously the fact that there are a lot of folks, including a lot of white folks, who are experiencing tremendous economic insecurity. I think one of the most important and still under-discussed phenomena in our society in the last few years has been this explosion in opioid and other drug addiction, leading to these very significant declines in life expectancy for certain segments of the white population, which is unprecedented. So these are real things that people are experiencing that are making them look for, answers to why their lives really feel like they're spinning out of control and going downhill. So I do think that stuff is important to take seriously. I just wish it could be separated out from things like worrying about whether somebody is going to looking like Tom Hanks and Bosom Buddies is going to walk into a woman's bathroom and prey upon people.
And what's shocking about that, and this doesn't help, this is a classic stats example that shows up in every stats book. And, we on this show discuss how regularly people don't get the stats. Gosh, Brian, you could just call this "We're Arrogant Jerks." Don't call it that, because Jonathan, you're a great guest, and I don't want that as a title with you on. But I was going to say, there's a common stats problem, which like an insurance agency sells you coverage for like all disasters, and then sells you for like all disasters and terrorist attacks. And you can wisely, a stats person goes, well, one of those is all encompassing. It already includes the terrorist attack, so it doesn't matter. Why would you pay extra? But that people are willing to. And so you have this statistic problem that you're kind of saying, which, we have all of these issues that they're spitting out, and you can't really explain the stats well, and that just gets rough.
Yeah. So to try to turn around the arrogant jerks argument a little bit, I mean, one way I try to think about this is that, so many people, I know you two, you and Patrick and all of you have talked about this so much, is people emphasize things like the eye test or going with their gut. And, the desire to, instead of those things, use data in a way is saying, I don't trust myself. I'm not better and more omniscient and smarter than anybody else. And so I know if I'm just sort of basing how I think about everything on my own instincts, then I'm going to get stuff wrong a lot. And actually, that's something that frustrates me sometimes when, if you do use data, et cetera, you're accused of being arrogant and snobbish, et cetera. Because
or one I hate is not getting it. You're just a book room looking at this, and I go, okay.
Yeah, right. Yes, that too. But I'm somewhat frustrated by that argument for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, I guess let's ask this, because we can go on for a bit, we can go for a bit longer, of course, but is there any optimism, maybe? Because as I mentioned, I just picked up your book today. I started it, was impressed. Obviously I haven't finished it. I've read a couple articles. Is there any optimism for the future, in terms of what's happened? Like, does this lead to better? Is there any hope that this leads to better stuff, or are we just in the middle of a rise of something kind of scary?
Well, I am optimistic, but my optimistic future is maybe somebody else's nightmare, which is, I think that we are in a particular stage of our political history that will resolve itself over, I don't know whether it's going to be over the next 6 years or 12 years, but it will resolve itself for the following reason. Because there are certain demographic realities in the United States that are simply unavoidable. Every presidential election, the electorate becomes that much more non-white. And you cannot keep winning you cannot hope to win presidential elections if you keep alienating almost all non-white voters. And I think eventually the Republican Party will come to terms with this reality. In fact, they wrote an autopsy, they called it this, after the 2012 election, in which they essentially said, we cannot continue alienating non-white voters. And then they got Trump.
That happened, and I mean, what am I supposed to say, right? My family, my grandfather, is from Mexico. My grandfather and grandmother, both from Mexico. My dad, first generation American. And when a presidential candidate comes up and basically says everybody coming in from Mexico is a thieving rapist, I kind of looked around and went, okay, someone else that's not me has to find this terrifying and unacceptable. And then, of course, I watched around and his poll numbers went up. And for me, just personally, that was terrifying. Another example I have is I have some relatives in Arizona, and I kind of at this point refuse to ever visit them because, this is a state that's behind the wall, that was behind legislation to essentially say you could stop anybody that you thought looked suspicious if you thought they were an illegal immigrant, and ask them for their papers. And I said, I'm a brown person. I'm never going to go to a state where you have people that support open carry, guarding the border, and just stopping random people to ask. And, by the way, I guess I say this very, I don't know the word, but, obviously I say this, and I'm sure there are people who live in New York that just look at me and go, you have no idea how this country works. So,
well, I mean, Dre, I would say to that, first of all, to me, it's completely understandable that you would feel the way you do. But second of all, to return to the question of optimism, I do think that it's important to remember that the typical Republican primary voter is not the typical American. That most Americans do not actually think that Mexican immigrants are all rapists and murderers. A lot do. I wouldn't deny that.
That's what's rough is you just go, you look around and you go, really, really? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean it's depressing that as many think that way as they do, but it remains true that is Trump is looking really good right now, because he just came out of a Republican primary electorate that I would say has attitudes that are very much outside the American mainstream. Or at least I choose to think that, because the alternative is more horrifying to come.
Well, yeah, when you think about the numbers, right? So Trump got what, 40-something% of Republican primary voters, right? That's only a subset of the Republican Party.
Exactly.
Most of them aren't voting. And even then, the Republican Party is what at this point, like 30% of Americans, 35?
Not even.
Not even. So it's going down, right? So he's got a ceiling on the number of voters he can get.
He does. As you say that, Brian, of course, then I shudder a little bit, because this is the running joke now that for the last 10 months, everybody's been talking about Trump's ceiling, and he keeps busting through it. But I do think that in the general election, he's going to be fighting on very different terrain than he's been so far.
It's kind of been sad for us because I don't even want to. It's not a feud. It does not qualify as a feud. But we've had some issues with 538, and it basically sums up to Neil Payne and I met at Sloan a few years ago, and I thought he was a jerk. That sums up the feud. But so we haven't really liked 538 basketball analysis for a while, and so it's funny because you talked at the very top of the podcast about the hate towards other things can be a more driving motivator than optimism towards yourself. So, the Boxscore Geeks has got more people. We've got great guests such as yourself. And yet sometimes I still look at 538, I'm like RPM, and get annoyed. But what's slightly annoying is, I basically said, you guys aren't good at basketball analysis, but politics was their thing. And so the fact that Nate Silver basically came out and said, don't worry about Trump, this is ridiculous, he's never going to be the Republican nomination, and then he gets it. I'm like, this isn't how I wanted to win this quote unquote feud or fight. I was like, I wanted you to be wrong about like Carmelo going to the Lakers. I didn't want you to be wrong about Donald Trump.
Right. So, yes, I mean, right. Nate has been spectacularly wrong about Trump, as he himself has readily admitted. Of course, his real strength, and what I would say remains his genius, was in how he has communicated the accuracy of polling as long as you have enough polls and you read them correctly. And so, if he gets the general election wrong, then I think it'll be time to really rethink his special genius. But I'm going to give him a pass, since almost everyone else got Trump wrong too, pending how he does calling the November election.
So this might be taking us, probably keeps us a little on subject. One interesting thing you said is, as the demographics shift, the party can't keep doing this. And I don't have them readily. I'd run and get them. But one of my favorite comedians is named Hari Kondabolu. I've seen him in concert twice now. I actually have a shirt that says 2042 because that's the demographic period that they believe is going to be the year when white people are no longer the majority in the United States. Yep. Hari's got a joke, though, that he goes, basically, that's only if you count all of the minorities as one amorphous entity, which we're not. There are lots of different. But so that's his joke. But what I was going to say about that is one thing that fascinates me is, for instance, the NCAA and how we've got an organization, even basketball, that have a lot of minorities in them, but have for years managed to keep policies that are very, very, coded or not, very racist, and have kept in power. And year after year, we look at the NCAA and go, this has to be the year where, come on, it's ridiculous. You got to give them money. You can't just keep treating, underprivileged minorities so poorly, and yet year after year it keeps coming back. So I guess, I hate to keep going both sides of the fence, optimist or not, but that seems like an organization where the same argument would apply. And we're still waiting, and I'd argue maybe 2 or 3 decades past what we might have expected.
Well, no, and to your point, Dre, just more broadly, right? The numbers alone, it's a well taken caution. The numbers alone are not going to shift the nature of power in the United States, right? It's going to take other things to make that a reality. But I do think, at least in terms of the likelihood, for example, of Trump winning a majority of voters in November, because of the demographic realities, he faces a really uphill climb.
And I definitely hope that's true. Brian, we've been all over the place I'll say myself, I've been an arrogant jerk, because you can't do that when you're saying, oh, what are these people thinking? Brian, anything to end this particular subject on?
Yeah, sure. So I'll be a little more pessimistic since Dre was just trying to be optimistic here. So, one of these things I always read over and over again is that politics is about systems. It's not about individuals. So Trump is going to crash and burn in the general. Knock on wood, right? It's very, very likely that happens.
Yeah.
But his voting bloc is not going to go away, right? These authoritarian voters. So someone else could come along that's maybe a better politician than Trump and capture them more despite these demographics. What's going to happen to these people? Are they going to try to, stay within the Republican coalition, form their own, what's going to happen to them in the future?
Well, and let me so that, Brian, that point is well taken. I don't think they're not going away the day after the election, and some other talented and opportunistic politician or politicians can come along and speak to them. But furthermore, and this is something that Mark and I wrote about in the book a few years ago. There are circumstances, and 9/11 was one of them, when less authoritarian-minded people start to think a lot like authoritarians do, and those
they become activated. Is that the word you use?
Yeah, that's one word that gets used, and it's when something catastrophic happens. Because we're all, needless to say, every single one of us is prone to fearful thinking under some circumstances. It's just we're not all equally prone, and we're prone for different reasons. But when our very lives feel like they're being threatened, then we start to think a lot alike. And under those circumstances, I'd say all bets are off in terms of how many people might support a candidate like Trump. If there were a series of terrorist attacks in American cities this fall, God forbid, for many reasons, who knows what would happen. So It's definitely not as simple as I was portraying it, and your point is well taken.
And one interesting thing about the people that both support Trump is a lot of the same people support kind of Sanders or Trump. And it seems like what they really want is ironically what, the Obama administration ran is they want change. And I do find that fascinating and maybe a little optimistic, even if not the right way, which is, there are people out there that basically say if Trump isn't the Democratic nominee, they don't know who they'll vote for, which is so head scratching to me in so many ways. I don't even know what to say. Um, but at
Jay,
the same,
did you mean that if Sanders were not the Democratic nominee?
yeah, if Sanders, did I say Clinton or did I say Sanders?
You
Or
said
did I say,
Trump.
I said Trump. I meant, so here's the
Okay.
point.
Yeah, yeah,
I've
yeah.
seen people that are basically Trump and or Sanders supporters. They're one or the other.
Yeah.
And so they
Yeah.
go, if Sanders doesn't get the Democratic nominee, thanks for catching that one, that they don't know who they'll vote for. And I go, how can you not really? But to
Right.
the point being that there's maybe something a little optimistic there, saying that there are people that are supporting this authoritarianism viewpoint that are also perfectly willing to support the viewpoint that says banks are to blame for everything. And, it's hard to fight against that candidly, to say that, banks are major problems and we need more social stuff. Maybe there's optimism there. So maybe someone comes in the middle from maybe a little more muted in the middle, not so Hitler comparison-y and maybe not so doesn't understand economics.
Yeah, well, I mean, to that point, it could be that if we manage to get to a place where, for example, inequality in the United States wasn't as significant as it is now, and people didn't feel as much economic insecurity as they do, then these kinds of messages wouldn't resonate even with people for whom they do resonate because we are in the circumstances we're in.
Oh yeah, the
So,
the job the job fear mongering works tremendously well in
yes.
economic uncertainty. So even if people just have more safety nets and stuff, that alone, you go, okay, they're going to take my job. I still get a steady
Because
paycheck.
Dre, like Sanders is a left wing populist and Trump is a right wing populist, right? And they do have some overlap. I know people blow me up for this, but Sanders is using fear of trade deals to drive people to the polls and all that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think
Yeah.
there's lots of ways in which, just in terms of who they're attracting, they're obviously different. But there's no question that they are both doing well because they're speaking to a real anxiety that people are experiencing. And this has been a criticism, by the way, of the mainstream Democratic Party, including the Clinton strand of the Democratic Party for a long time, which is that they have not adequately attended to the anxieties of working class voters, and therefore they've left themselves vulnerable to having those voters, picked off by a populist candidate.
Yeah. So I have no idea where we ended. So listener, if you heard all that, I kind of, this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart for every American's heart at this point, right? If this does not hit your radar in some way, something weird is going on, and it's just, we're lucky enough that we have an expert like yourself, Jonathan, who's willing to come on and talk because that is amazing. I don't know if it's your call. We've got a little longer on the show. We can wind down and talk some boring sports stuff or depressing sports stuff. I'll leave it to your option since you're giving us your time.
I probably I seem to have I think it might be my daughter's trying to reach me, so I should probably try to
Okay,
attend.
well, thank
Yeah,
you so much for that. Is fine. Hopefully,
yeah.
I've said this to a lot of guests, and I want to make it more clear that I'm saying this to the listener so the listener understands. We have fantastic guests on the Boxscore Geek Show, yourself being one of them, Jonathan. Jonathan Weiler, you're John Weiler on Twitter, the ESPNWatch.wordpress.com. You definitely need to check that out. You've been in Huffington Post, referenced in Vox, on CNN. You've been all over the place. I've been wickedly amazed. Any place else I'm missing?
No, I think you've covered it. And I want to say just to Dre and Brian and Patrick in absentia, thank you for indulging me, and I always love talking to you guys.
But
So
I guess the way I wanted to end that phrasing is a lot of our guests on the show, it is poor time management on my part because I don't schedule as well as it's one of those things I'd like to improve. But, the fact that we have such great guests that put up with me getting behind on my schedule. We appreciate it so much, and thank you so much for being on the show. I'm trying to think if I have any wind downs, Brian. I did want to. Can't think of anything else. I might be seeing Dave Barry this week. That's a possible shout out. He's going to be at a Moneyball conference. If either of you have a shout out to give, I'll say that's it, and we can end the show.
No, I'm good to go.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good too.
Well, thanks so much, and I'm sure we'll have you on again at some point in the near future.
All right, thanks,
Jonathan.
guys.
Thanks
I
so much.
appreciate it.
All right, so Brian, do you want me to just do the wind down? And yeah, Jonathan, feel free to go. I'm just going to end the show. So we've got the tail end.
Let's take it out. Let's take it out.
All right, so this has been the Boxscore Geek Show. Reminder, that was special guest Jonathan Weiler. I don't know if we helped any, if you're feeling more optimistic, more pessimistic, I don't know. That is the economist way of doing things, right, Brian?
That's right. Yeah, it's, that's right.
I think we had 5 or 6, it's not on the other hand today. We had 5 or 6 hands, but that was a fantastic talk. I definitely enjoyed it.
It's a probabilistic world, Dre.
I love it. That's a good quote. That's a good T-shirt. Anyway, what I was going to say, this has been the Boxscore Geek Show. If you did not find us through the site, we are on boxscoregeeks.com. We're also on iTunes and Stitcher. You can find us as the Boxscore Geek Show. Subscribe, upvote, all of that helps. We go live every week, usually 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, usually Tuesday or Wednesday. Threw a curveball this week. It was Monday, but that was for our amazing guest. If you missed the live show, you can catch the recap on YouTube channel Nerd Numbers. Special guests to people in the comment section. I wasn't in it for most of it, but Andrew Sutton, for instance, we appreciate you commenting. Do it every week. We enjoy that. I think that's everything I got, Brian. So enjoy the playoffs. Steph Curry is back tonight. Of course, I'm saying that in the past if you're listening to this in podcast form. So hopefully it was an enjoyable night. And with that, we'll see you next week.